Okay, thank you so much, Kevin. And yeah, I'll let you present yourself first, and then start with the talk.
Sounds good. Yeah, thank you for having me. If anyone has questions, don't be afraid to interrupt me. I can't see anything other than my slides. I'm not sure how to set up Google Meet, so just feel free to interrupt. I can't really see anything on Google Meets. So I'm Kevin. I'm a PhD candidate at CMU, and one of my primary kind of research focuses is on accelerating and scaling MLIP inference. And what I mean by that is increasing the time scale of our simulations as well as the length scale, so increasing the number of atoms of our simulations. Alrighty. So I'm sure, as many of you know, performing accurate molecular dynamics or simulation is quite computationally challenging. So here I have this plot where the y-axis is the time scale and the x-axis is the length scale. And we have, in these circles, we have kind of the techniques that people typically use for simulating these types of physical systems. And kind of the goal with machine learning interatomic potentials is we want to take like this high fidelity kind of method of simulation, which is ab initio DFT, and ideally scale them to timescales and length scales, and try to replace some of these lower fidelity methods, maybe at the nanoscale or at the mesoscale. And that's kind of what the primary focus of this talk will be today. So I'll be talking about two of our kind of recent works, one of them on distributed inference for MLIPs, and the second one will be on smooth dynamic cutoffs. So we insert a layer that allows us to have dynamic cutoffs instead of fixed cutoffs while maintaining smoothness. So just kind of some maybe prerequisite kind of a recap. We have most MLIPs are formulated as GNNs, where we have like these node features or edge features. And if we were to consider kind of this gray node in the center here, we would take all of the node features from its one-hop neighbors and then perform some nonlinearity or some nonlinear operation followed by some aggregation over the neighbors. And so if we have this three-layer GNN and we only consider this gray this gray node in the middle, after one layer, we would be incorporating features from just the one-hop neighbors. But then after two layers, we would be incorporating information from the two-hop neighbors. And then after three layers, it would be the three-hop neighbors. So after three layers, this gray node will have information that is kind of mixed from all of its three-hop neighbors. And so if we kind of take a look at how currently people do like multi-GPU MLIP simulation, typically the primary workhorse for this simulation is via LAMPs. And for the rest of this talk, I'll kind of denote this as LAMP spatial partitioning. And the method is quite straightforward. So we first, or what LAMPs does, is it first partitions a space into n, in this example, 16 mutually exclusive partitions, denoted kind of like these black boxes here. And then it will expand each of these mutually exclusive partitions to incorporate like these ghost nodes or border nodes or halos, whatever you like to call them. But we perform this expansion, which is this gray box right here, beyond our initial mutually exclusive partition. And this expansion is going to be up to the interaction radius of the MLIP itself. So it would be the cutoff times the total number of convolutions for that MLIP. And the reason we need to do this is because if you were to consider an atom in the top right corner of this mutually exclusive partition, it would still require, let's say, the 4-hop neighbors or the 5-hop neighbors, which would kind of bleed over into the surrounding partitions, which is why we need to perform this expansion. Afterwards, we perform n, or in this case, 16 independent energy and force calculations. So we're just doing 16 forward and backward passes to get forces. And we aggregate this onto some head server and then or some head node and then perform our MD step. So the advantages is that the implementation is quite simple. It doesn't really require you to modify much of the model code itself. And also the energy and force calculations are actually totally independent of each other. And that means that there's really no overhead until you calculate your energy per atom and then as well as your forces, and you just aggregate a very small amount of data at the end of your forward and backward pass for every single mutually exclusive partition. The disadvantages, though, is really the core thing that we would like to overcome is that this interaction radius, so this expansion up to over 36 angstroms of the interaction radius, means that we have a huge amount of redundant calculation. And the reason it's redundant is because if we consider all of the nodes that are within, the expanded partition, but outside of the mutually exclusive partition, we actually, these are kind of like the expanded nodes. We actually discard these nodes after every single forward and backward pass. So we're not actually using any of this information at all. And the reason is because it's not the most up-to-date. It's not kind of the most up-to-date energy and force calculation. And kind of a quintessential example presented in the Allegro paper is that if you had 96 atoms of some liquid at standard temperature and pressure, and a 36 angstrom interaction radius, you would have almost 21,000 atoms that are within your ghost node cutoff that you're effectively going to be throwing away ultimately. And that's going to take up a lot of compute time, as well as a lot of, more importantly, a lot of GPU memory. That's going to be wasted.
I have a question.
And so, oh yes.
Does this partition take into account the density, or you might end up with just like partitions where you have so many atoms and others less?
Yeah, the proper load balancing for large scale systems, you would have to account for, ideally you would account for edge density, because the edges are kind of the primary, I think, bottleneck for like GPU memory and compute time. But we use node density as a proxy for edge density. So a kind of a simple implementation would be like a KD tree, for example, where you try and load balance the nodes across your partitions.
Right,
Yeah,
and
that is correct.
This is already embedded in LAMPS, right?
Oh yeah, LAMPS already supports this.
Okay.
Yep. But the solution that we propose is a very simple one, but the implementation kind of gets a little tricky, is that we would ideally move forward one layer at a time and then transfer the necessary node information after each layer. And so if we consider, LAMP spatial partitioning, and we have a simple graph, we have the green partition with the green nodes and the yellow partition with the yellow nodes. If we perform this LAMP spatial partitioning with a 3-layer GNN, we would need to effectively incorporate the entire graph on both partitions, right? Because we would need to calculate the energy and forces for these green nodes, we would have to do a 3-hop expansion, and this entire graph is only a 3-hop expansion away anyways. So this is quite useless, at least in LAMP spatial partitioning for this kind of toy example. But with kind of this new idea where we do this layer-wise information transfer, we only need to extend up to the 1-hop neighbors. And so we have this green partition, we have the green nodes and the blue nodes. We only expand to the 1-hop neighbors. And then, for example, after a single layer, a forward pass for a single layer on these green nodes, we now need to include the most up-to-date, let's say, blue node right here, for the next forward pass on the green nodes. And in order to do so, we would just try to transfer the node features from the correct partition onto our green partition, and then do the next forward pass, at least for the next layer of our green partition. Right. So that's the kind of the core idea. And kind of describing it in a different way is, again, we'll start with a simple atom graph. We do this partitioning, and we into green, gray, and these black nodes. We'll kind of assign the 1-hop expansions of these black, green, and gray nodes onto their respective GPUs, as well as, again, their 1-hop neighbors. And then so after we do this partitioning and this splitting, we'll do the forward pass for all of the GPUs. And then we will kind of transfer the information that is necessary to perform the next pass. So if we consider this GPU 3 down here, which kind of owns these gray nodes, it also requires like these black nodes as well as these green nodes right here. So we would just transfer this information. And then in order to prepare ourselves for the forward pass for the second layer, we'll do the second layer forward pass, and then we can kind of aggregate everything back onto CPU memory if the MD engine is running on CPU, and then perform an MD step. We also implemented DistMLIP into ChargeNet, which includes a 3-body graph. And the way we do partitioning is also quite similar, but except instead of just having 1-hop neighbors in the graph, we also do expansions up to 2-hop neighbors. And we use this expanded version, or this 2-hop neighbor expanded version, in order to reconstruct, kind of on the fly, reconstruct the 3-body graph that we would then calculate metadata for in order to perform the node transfer. So in summary, though, we kind of perform this expansion and this partitioning. We create this edge table, which allows for like highly parallelized reads and writes. The edge table is really only to kind of construct this 3-body graph. If anyone has any questions on this, I can definitely talk about it later. We have these kind of partitions, or we have these subgraphs on our GPUs, and then we're just going to perform a forward pass, and then a forward pass on our atom graph, a forward pass on our bond graph, if the model supports a bond graph, and then the necessary node transfer, and then more forward passes until we ultimately can get an energy prediction. And then the backward pass, in order to calculate forces, we can just directly do backprop and then transfer the gradients across GPUs just in the reverse order of the forward pass. So that's pretty straightforward. And most of the time it's handled by PyTorch. Yeah, I think there was a question.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that so clearly. I have a question regarding the many body order. Is it like you create an artificial node that you can then partition for that?
Are you asking about the formulation of the graph?
Yes.
Sorry,
like, for example, here it looks like are you showing going from the graph on the left to the one on the right, where you add the free body problem here, like the free body?
Yeah, so it's not exactly. So the one on the left is the atom graph that we need to partition and calculate metadata for. We actually start out with a one-hop neighbor graph on the left. So this is going to be used for atom graph, and then a two-hop neighbor graph on the right, where instead of just finding neighbors for the one-hop, we also find neighbors for the two-hop. We also find the two-hop neighbors. And then we're going to use this two-hop neighbor graph and then transform it into the three-body graph.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yep. Alrighty. And then, so in terms of experimental results, we implemented it on 4 models, so MACE, TensorNet, ChargeNet, and ESIN. Later on, after the paper was released on arXiv, we also implemented it on UMA, and UMA we find scales much better than ESIN for some like numerical precision reasons. But this plot here is showing the maximum amount of atoms that we can fit on 1, 2, 4, and 8 GPUs, and this is normalized to 1 here, just to show scaling. This graph here is showing if we hold the total number of atoms in the system constant and increase the number of GPUs, what does the wall clock time look like? So strong scaling. This plot here is showing weak scaling. So if we hold the number of atoms per GPU constant and we increase the total number of GPUs, ideally, we would stay around 1 normalized wall clock time, but we do show some increase. So there's overhead, of course. And then here on an 8 GPU setup, we show how the wall clock time scales with the increase in interaction radius. So it does scale linearly, which makes a lot of sense compared to LAMP's spatial partitioning, which would scale between quadratically and cubically. And then we also show the MD step time with respect to the number of parameters for each model on 8 GPUs, as well as the maximum capacity with respect to the number of parameters also on 8 GPUs, and to find the scaling works. Scaling kind of makes sense. But on to maybe something that's perhaps a little bit more grounded. We tested these 4 material systems or 4 periodic systems, as well as one. So 2W49 is it's an insect wing protein. And these are all these pre-trained models. And we kind of compare the 1 to 8 GPU performance. And we also tried or benchmarked these systems against this LMACE 3.8 million. So MACE 3.8 million is the MACE this is the MACE implemented onto DistMLIP. And then LMACE 3.8 million is the same exact MACE model, except implemented onto via LAMP's spatial partitioning. And generally we find that DistMLIP, with DistMLIP, we can simulate up to, it's about 3x, maybe a little bit more atoms than LAMP spatial partitioning. And kind of the strongest piece of evidence of that is even on 8 GPUs, we cannot simulate this entire insect wing protein. But with 4 GPUs on DistMLIP, we can already simulate this wing protein. And one thing to note is that MACE only has a 10 angstrom interaction radius by design. So if we were to consider a model like ChargeNet, which has a 45 angstrom interaction radius, the difference between this LAMP's implementation or LAMP spatial partitioning with ChargeNet versus a DistMLIP version of ChargeNet, we would expect that gap to be significantly larger than just 3x. We just didn't perform those baselines because there does not exist a LAMP support for ChargeNet. So at the time of the paper, we only had LAMP support for MACE. And then also, so ESIN, we have a new UMA implementation as well. And then here's just some numbers comparing. So we just did like vertical wall partitioning, as opposed to any fancier load balancing or like KD tree or other or Voronoi cells or any kind of partitioning technique. And we show that even very fast low overhead partitioning, we can run a lot faster than maybe some graph-based partitioning techniques that don't account for or that don't kind of consider some of the spatial inductive biases that we can take advantage of. So yeah, that was the kind of the highlight of this MLIP work. So I'll move on to some of our more recent work on smooth cutoffs. And so if we kind of zoom out from the notion of using, throwing more GPUs at the problem in order to increase scale or decrease inference time, um, we we kind of noticed that there are, and maybe this is perhaps a little obvious, is that there are two primary bottlenecks for MLIPs. The first is MD just happens to require millions to billions of inference calls, just by nature of the integration. And the second one is, we're kind of bottlenecked by memory if we wanted to perform ultra high throughput workflows. So a large number of small atomic systems all being simulated in parallel. Or we're also bottlenecked by memory if we wanted to do some large scale simulation. So um, if you wanted to have one system simulate a large number of atoms. And sorry, was there a question?
Yeah, sorry, quick question before you move on to this part. Regarding this MLIP, do you think it can be used for training as well? And have you tried it, or does it like improve training on larger systems?
Yeah, that's a good question. So DistMLIP, it works for both training and inference. So the core innovation is we wrote like very fast, like low level optimized C code in order to do this metadata calculation, and and partitioning. So it does work for training. The reason we don't necessarily highlight training is because um, we haven't really found an application in which we necessarily need to train on structures that are, for example, 250,000 or consisting of 250,000 atoms. Typically, what we're finding with data sets that are curated or calculated using DFT is our structures in the hundreds. And so we don't necessarily need a situation in which we are performing training over a single large system, but rather we can do this like the normal like batch training and then DDP or data parallel training, as opposed to like system parallel training. I do know there is some work from the Faircam group a few years ago that tried to look at graph partitioning. So it's a very similar, like somewhat similar approach to what we have here, but their primary focus is on training. But yeah, if you have any questions about that, I can definitely kind of refer to that paper.
Yeah, that's clear. Thank you.
Alrighty. So moving on. So kind of some preliminary background, and probably this is a recap for many, is the standard MLIP or these GNN-based MLIPs or even attention-based MLIPs. They define a fixed cutoff radius, and they kind of combine this fixed cutoff radius with an envelope function, where they're effectively weighting the messages or the information being sent from these neighbors to the center node by this kind of weight right here. So by the distance that these neighbors are from the center node. And the reason why people do this is because if you were to consider this atom right here, if this atom were throughout the simulation leaving this fixed cutoff, and we did not incorporate this weighting function to the messages, there would be a discontinuity the moment that this edge gets snapped, right? And this is just because graphs are discrete structures. And yeah, so typically this is the standard setup, right? So we define a fixed cutoff. Let's say it's 6 angstroms or 5 angstroms. And then we multiply the incoming messages with the weights of the polynomial envelope. And typically, I mean, this leads to like a really nice smooth energy surface shown in the bottom right corner. So this bottom right corner is just a TensorNet, a trained TensorNet model on the MatPS R2 scan dataset. But what people have found in maybe the most recent like year or so, maybe several months, is that if we were to instead instead of taking all the neighbors within this fixed cutoff that is by like 5 or 6 angstroms, what if we instead restricted, or we took only the 20 nearest neighbors, or we took a maximum 20 neighbors or 40 neighbors to a particular center node? And they find that, and this is from the Orb v3 paper, they find that the authors find that performing like this max neighbors leads to very nice memory and speed improvements. And so the things I want to highlight, or the columns I would like to highlight, are like these columns right here that I'm circling. The left here is an Orb v3 conservative model with infinite neighbors, and then the right here is the exact same model with 20 neighbors. So they find a very substantial inference speed up as well as memory reduction. And the other thing to highlight is, or the other kind of pair I want to highlight was the Orb v3 direct model with infinite number of neighbors compared to the Orb v3 direct model with 20 neighbors, and we kind of see these same patterns. But the issue is, if we were to restrict the maximum number of neighbors, we result in an unsmooth energy surface. So here we have the fixed cutoff energy surface, and here we have the exact same setup with the exact same model, except instead of a fixed cutoff, we just implement a max neighbors cutoff where the polynomial envelope is set to 0, or it's set to scale to 0 at the 20th neighbor. We have a very discontinuous energy surface, right? But kind of one question is, why do we necessarily care about smoothness in the first place? Like, is it fine if we had a slightly unsmooth or discontinuous surface, but then we let the model kind of learn around these discontinuities, right? So the model will still be highly accurate, and then near these discontinuities, the model can kind of smoothen out the discontinuities via training. Right. And so we try to do this. And so we took this TensorNet model with max neighbors, we refine-tuned it to really great accuracy to good accuracy. And then we tried to perform some 100 picosecond simulation. This is a 3000 Kelvin, I think it's like some high temperature, maybe silicon dioxide system. And we find the temperature just, it blows up almost immediately as a result of even very, very teeny tiny discontinuities within the energy surface. And these teeny tiny in terms of the magnitude of these discontinuities. And the answer to this kind of question of why we care about smoothness can kind of be found in a recent paper by Fairchem. This is the Eason paper, where they show, or they kind of allude to a previous result that shows that the total energy drift of a particular simulation over total of t time is upper bounded by these two terms right here. And these two terms, so this term on the left is is showing that, ideally we would like to have a small time step in order to have low energy drift. And this term on the right, put simply, is to show that the bound on the energy drift scales with delta Tn, or delta T to the nth power, which is something that we really care about, right? And n in this case is it's the order of differentiability for our energy surface, right? So in the max neighbors case, we have a very discontinuous undifferentiable surface, whereas in the fixed cutoff, we have a very differentiable surface. And this right term kind of explains why we might be seeing a little bit of that energy drift. It also explains why, as we have a more differentiable energy surface, we can kind of maybe increase our time step a little bit in order to, and still kind of maintain some fixed upper bound.
I have a question regarding the visualization here. How do you notice the small spikes or the discontinuities? Like, how do you make this visualization essentially? Is it like run MD and then you project them on some small dimension? Okay.
Yes, no, this is, oh, sorry. Yeah, I was just nodding along. Yeah, that's a good question. So we have a kind of a toy setup where we put oxygen on a grid, and then we scale, or we're moving another atom on top of this grid across the grid lines. And this is just to show, so it's a very unphysical system, but it's just to show, it's kind of like a toy visualization for, what the energy surface may look like, or what it should look like, or at least in this case, what it should not look like.
And in that toy example, because you have only 2 atoms, right? Or
this was like, I think 61 atoms. So we had 60 atoms in a grid, and then 1 atom that was kind of scaled along the 2 dimensions in order to get the energy.
And that's enough to get this atom in and out of the max neighbor cutoff?
Oh yeah, that's correct. So the max neighbors here was set to 20. And then we did have PBC enabled along the grid. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. All right, so moving on. Our kind of goal is, what if we can get the best of both worlds, where we want to maintain these smoothness properties to maintain stable simulation, while we also want to kind of restrict the number of neighbors somehow, or prune away the neighbors that we feel are too far. And the way we do this is, what if we implemented a dynamic cutoff instead of a fixed cutoff? So what if our cutoff can kind of modulate, or it can shrink, or it can grow depending on the number of atoms that are currently within the dynamic cutoff? So if there are too few atoms in the dynamic cutoff, it will grow. If there are too many, the dynamic cutoff will ideally shrink to kind of target mu number of neighbors. This is kind of an illustration for what it kind of looks like if we have one center node in a dynamic cutoff versus a fixed cutoff, where we can kind of control the number of neighbors for the dynamic cutoff, whereas the fixed one is up to just the density of the node density of that system. Sorry, the atom density of that system. And the way we do the dynamic cutoff is actually surprisingly straightforward. There are just some kind of tricks that we do in order to enforce, or in order to provably enforce the differentiability. And so here I just took an excerpt from the paper because I feel is maybe the best way to kind of elaborate on some things, but I'll kind of talk through it. The first thing we do is, if we were to consider some center node V, and then so we have some center node V, and then we denote NV as the set of neighbors to V. And now we were to consider these nodes U. What we're doing here is we want to calculate the rank of U with respect to all of the other neighbors of V, right? So for every neighbor of V, we want to calculate a smooth rank of them. And the way we do this is this is a very kind of a somewhat well-documented technique, is we do this sum of sigmoids, where for all the other neighbors of V that are not U, we calculate whether or not that neighbor is below or is closer to the center node V than U is, and then we just sum up the sigmoids, right? And this makes this ranking like somewhat smooth. What's a little bit less well known of a technique is we also actually have to multiply the kind of like this ranking, or each of the individual sigmoids or we have to weight it by the polynomial envelope function with respect to not U, but with respect to the other neighbor that we're calculating against, which is T here. And the reason we do this is to ensure that if some node T is about to leave the fixed cutoff radius, we don't want the other rankings to jiggle and be perturbed, right? So if some atom is about to leave the fixed cutoff, we don't want any kind of perturbations to occur, which will lead to, again, a discontinuity in the energy surface. And then here on the left, we plotted the dynamic ranks. So this is the ranks according to our view with respect to the true neighbor ranks, and this is just for some given atom, some given center atom. And we find that, in the kind of it tracks quite well, right? And this is just by property of this sum of sigmoid technique. But as we get closer and closer to the fixed cutoff, we find that the tracking between dynamic ranks and true neighbor ranks kind of falls off. And this is to be expected because we're also multiplying this polynomial envelope against this sum of or against each individual sigmoids before performing the sum. And so this makes sense as the neighbors get closer and closer to the fixed cutoff. Ideally, the corresponding strength in the ranking calculation is declined until, in the limit, this curve here should plateau. Right? And this is what allows us to maintain smoothness, but still calculate a kind of a somewhat discrete notion of, it maintains smoothness, but still calculate kind of a discrete structure like ranking. And then here, this is just we should be formulating the polynomial envelope. So after we calculate these ranks for a single center atom, we use the PDF, so the probability distribution, or probability density function of the normal distribution that is centered at our target mu neighbors in order to define a smooth weighting function over the ranks themselves. So note, it's not a smooth weighting function over the neighbor distances, but rather a smooth weighting function over the ranks that we've calculated. And we use this and construct a weighted average right here, a kind of a goofy weighted average right here of the neighbor distances where the weights are this weighting function applied on top of the calculated ranks, right? So what we're trying to do, or the intuition behind what we're trying to do here, is to say, we've calculated a rank for each of our neighbors, and we want to somehow pick the kind of the dynamic cutoff. And in order to do so, we are giving the rank 20th atom the most importance for picking the dynamic cutoff, which ideally has 20 neighbors. That's kind of the intuition behind this weighted average. There are a couple of weird things. The first is we also include this polynomial envelope once again. And the reason we do this is we don't, again, when some atom leaves, we don't want kind of perturbations. But there's also some other theoretical reasons that if there are questions, I can definitely get into. And the second weird thing is we have this H epsilon over epsilon term, which kind of seems like a throwaway, or for numerical stability, but it's actually quite important. And the reason we have this is because as our neighbor list empties, so as the number of atoms within the fixed cutoff approaches 0 and reaches 0, we do not want our dynamic cutoff to collapse to 0. So for example, if we did not have this H epsilon over epsilon term, so this was canceled out, we would have a 0 divided by 0, and that would be kind of an error. But if we did not have this H epsilon term and we only had an epsilon term on the bottom for numerical stability reasons, then this sum would be 0 because there's nothing in the neighbor list. So these two sums would be 0. And then because we have just 0 divided by epsilon, which is just 0, right? And so this H epsilon, what we do is we multiply kind of this upper epsilon term with H, which is our fixed cutoff, in order to make sure that our dynamic cutoff approaches H as the last atom leaves the fixed cutoff H. All right, and if we look at some of the qualitative results, so again, this is the same exact setup, we find the dynamic cutoff, qualitatively, the energy surface looks quite good, and it's quite smooth. We have a proof of higher order differentiability in the paper. This was, I got a lot of help from the undergrad, Holland, so kudos to him. I'll just kind of skip this for now. And in terms of experimental results, one thing I would like to highlight.
Before we move on, I have a quick question with the cutoff radius that you compute here. Is it possible, I mean, I'm thinking while I'm talking, but is it possible that you have like run an MD simulation and you have two atoms and they might like compete each other to get the best rank while you run the simulation? And
yeah.
so like introduce non-smoothness by doing that? Or is that something that can address that as well?
So are you saying if we have two atoms that are near the same distance away from a center atom and they just kind of oscillate?
Yeah, exactly. While you run your simulation, they would just like you have one coming in and out.
Oh, yes, that's a good question. So this is definitely very possible. But the reason why this is not an issue on smoothness is because the way we calculate ranks with this sigmoid is the sigmoid contribution. If our UV, so if the distance to the atom that we would like to, or the neighbor that we would like to calculate the rank for, is sufficiently different from the competing atom, then this sigmoid would be 1. But if these RUV and RTV, so these competing atoms are are equidistant from each other, are very, very similar, very, very close, this sigmoid would be pushed to, in a smooth manner, it would be pushed to 0. And so we would not have any ranking contribution from this competing atom, from the competing neighbor. And this would be all happen in a smooth manner because of the formulation of the sigmoid.
Okay.
Yep. If there are any more questions on that, I can definitely answer them later as well.
Yep. Thank you.
Yep. Alrighty, so the experimental setup, we implemented this on 4 smaller Maze, Sneakwip, or TensorNet models. We did absolutely 0 hyperparameter tuning, just to kind of show the plug and play nature of the dynamic cutoff. And then we tried this on MatPES and the MD22 datasets. Here are generally the results, or at least the training results. These are the units are in MeV per atom and then MeV per angstrom. And the thing we would like to highlight are the differences between the fixed and the dynamic cutoff versions. Everything else, again, is exactly the same with no hyperparameter tuning. And we find that although there is discrepancy, of course, just because we're not including as many neighbors, the discrepancy we find is quite limited. And actually, recently we're trying to find ways to minimize this discrepancy even further, just via hyperparameter tuning. So I think there is still a little bit of wiggle room to go in order to minimize this discrepancy if some of the hyperparameters the training parameters were tuned just very slightly. And for MapPS, we have the results right here. This is a MapPS R2 scan, where the target number of neighbors was 40, and the target number of neighbors for the MD22 training runs was only 20. We do an experiment. So we had the proof on differentiability, but we also need to do an empirical simulation stability, kind of a mini study. We do these simulations at 100 picoseconds. This DWNT is the double wall nanotube system from MD22. And then we also simulate a lithium iron phosphate system at 3000 Kelvin, just to kind of battle test the dynamic cutoff under the stress of a large number of neighbor switches across 100 picoseconds, and we find it's very stable. In terms of speed and memory reduction, we take two like real world MOF and protein systems, and generally we find about 2x memory reduction, and then maybe about almost up to 2x inference speed up, using these the same models that we had trained in the slide or a couple slides prior. But kind of one question we'd like to ask ourselves is, like, where does this additional error come from? Like, why exactly is there a discrepancy between the fixed cutoff and the dynamic cutoff beyond just the lower expressivity? And when we plot the relative error increase, so this is the relative error increase of the dynamic cutoff model with respect to the corresponding fixed cutoff model. So the fixed cutoff model is just 0% here, it's the baseline. We find that typically the larger atomic radii within this MapPS dataset have higher relative error increases compared to some of the smaller atomic radii elements. And we kind of ask, perhaps why is this the case? And what we believe is, we believe this is coming from the fact that when the total number of neighbors drops, the dynamic cutoff actually drops neighbors even if there's a gap between the total number of neighbors and the target number of neighbors. So here we run the simulation. This is a melting simulation of, I think, copper. Yeah, I'll kind of talk more about the simulation in a little bit, or this plot in a little bit, a few slides from here. But the thing we want to highlight is if we look at the fixed cutoff, and then the dynamic, so the fixed cutoff is orange, and the dynamic cutoff is this middle curve in green. If we set the target number of neighbors to 20, and we perform this melting simulation, so the overall atomic density, so the density should be decreasing throughout time, is we find that as the number of neighbors approaches, in this case, like 35, the dynamic cutoff is not able to kind of sustainably hold the target number of neighbors at 20. So it's actually going to drop long before the fixed cutoff approaches 20 total neighbors, right? And so we believe that this might be the reason for why the larger atomic radii, which may have kind of local atomic neighborhoods of, let's say, 35 atoms or 40 atoms, why they may struggle during training compared to some of the smaller, more tightly packed atoms or elements. We also did a very short micro study on how to choose the target number of neighbors. And generally, we find that the more neighbors you have, the lower the error, right? And so we ran training on a TensorNet model for a buckyball catcher, as well as a double wall nanotube system. And then here on the x-axis, we have the fixed radii. And we find that as we approach 40, we can kind of approach the fixed cutoff baseline. I believe the buckyball catcher system has 60 average neighbors, and the double wall nanotube approaches 50 number of neighbors for the fixed cutoff, sorry. Another kind of question is, maybe why not we just reduce the fixed cutoff? So why do we have a dynamic cutoff as opposed to just, fixing the, as opposed to just reducing the length of the fixed cutoff? And the short answer is it doesn't really account for density fluctuations. So any kind of real world system in which you have density fluctuations, we won't be able to account for it. So under the same kind of plot I showed earlier, we also had this reduced fixed cutoff where we calculated the average to be 20 number of neighbors, and we find the cutoff to be 4.25. And then as we roll out the simulation, we significantly drop neighbors as the simulation progresses, whereas the dynamic cutoff is able to kind of hold the neighbors in a more sustainable fashion. And also what we find is, it also affects training. So if you were to reduce the fixed cutoff, if you were to reduce the fixed cutoff to your target number of average number of neighbors, and then do training, at least for a foundational potential, you may have some situations in which that reduced fixed cutoff still has too many neighbors for dense systems and then too few neighbors for sparse systems that you're training on. So there's kind of no calibration between dense and sparse systems. And this leads to significantly higher errors. So here, this is the TensorNet model that we trained on the MAT-PES dataset. And here's the dynamic cutoff result that I just copied from a previous table. And then here's the reduced fixed cutoff, where we calculate this reduced fixed cutoff to average 40 neighbors. And then the training results are a lot worse as well. All right, yeah, and that's the end of my talk. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I have one quick question. If you use a foundational model that has been trained on, say, fixed cutoff, and you want to adapt it to your technique, have you tried like fine-tuning with a new cutoff, or does it already perform well out of the box if you use that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we actually did study. We took the OML model, so the ORB v3 model trained on OML, the 25 million parameter one, and when we directly plug and play the dynamic cutoff, we find the errors explode, so it's unusable. But and this training run is actually currently ongoing. But if we apply the dynamic cutoff onto a pre-trained ORBML model, and then we do refine tuning, we find we can converge down to similar errors to the original ORBML in a significantly less amount of compute time. So
that makes sense. But do you know why it blows up? Because I would assume that you get somehow the same neighbors when you apply that.
So like why it blows up after we just plug and play the dynamic cutoff without retraining? Yeah, I think my hypothesis for this is if you were to plug and play the dynamic cutoff, intuitively it does make sense that the closest neighbors should have the most effect on the energy and force calculations. So if we take away the further neighbors, then we should have some kind of minimal effect or minimal effect to the errors. But I believe the reason why we're seeing this error blow up is related to the sensitivity of the prediction. I don't have a super great explanation, but I believe it's because for the regression task, let me think about this one actually. Yeah, I think it's because in the earlier layers of the ORBML model, if there's a slight discrepancy in the features as a result of pruning away the further neighbors, then that slight discrepancy will compound throughout the later parts of the model. So we just have to do this refine tuning to tell the model that it's no longer allowed to depend on the further neighbors. Yep.
Yeah, I would guess it's also very model dependent, right? You might have ESN, for instance, where this might happen less because of the smoothness that's enforced.
Yep.
All right. Do we have any questions in the chat?
All good.
Then yeah, if there is no question, I think we can stop. And thanks a lot, Kevin. I think that was a great talk. Everything was very easy to follow.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.